Well, thank you for having me. The last time I did a discussion when there was a Twitter wall along the side, it was very nerve-wracking because every 5 minutes everybody started laughing. I didn't know what they were laughing about. I knew it was someone who sent some kind of a message. So we'll see what happens with the laughing. And the other thing that happened last time I spoke was I gave this presentation. And as Anna said, it was a presentation about the way in which I and my colleagues were covering the riots in England. And one of the things about journalists covering the riots is that those of us who did not have cameras, we could, if you like, blend into the crowd. We could go incognito. So we would wear jeans and kind of hoodies so that we would not stand out. Because if journalists stood out and they were easily identifiable as journalists, then they were liable to be attacked by these rioters. And after I finished this presentation, somebody came up to me from the audience and said, the photograph at the beginning of the presentation, is that you? It's not me, okay? I can reassure you that behind the mask is someone entirely unidentifiable. So I want to talk to you a bit about how I and others covered the riots, and well, I didn't know that I had this mandate to talk about the next step, but that would be a good thing to discuss as well. I always think the best way to do these things is to have the audience asking questions, not just at the end of the session, but throughout as well. So if you have anything which I say which either doesn't make sense, or you disagree with, or you want to elaborate on, just put your hand up and we can have more of a discussion. I'd be disappointed if during the duration of this next 90 minutes nobody puts their hands up and interrupts. I think it will make for a better discussion. So let me begin by talking to you about the riots. Everybody can hear me, okay? Yes. Great. So how do I press this? Can I use this one there? Yeah. Okay. So I've split this discussion into two sections. The first is reporting the riots, and I'm going to try to make an argument to you which is that the best and most effective way we can do live reporting of certain types of stories, particularly live stories, is by using social media as the kind of instant method of broadcast. That's the most effective, fastest tool that we have when it comes to reporting. But it also means that we have to adopt a very different language, and we have to also adopt a very different style of journalism. But I think that the rewards are really quite significant if we do it correctly. That's the first part of the presentation, yeah? Using social media, specifically Twitter, which I'm sure all of you know what it is and how it works, to cover a big breaking news event. Now the second part of the presentation, I'm going to talk to you about something slightly more advanced, which is kind of long-term investigative work into something like the riots, and that was what Anna said we received an award for, which was a major piece of research that we did to try to find out the causes and the consequences of these disturbances in England in 2011. So I don't expect a Finnish audience to be experts in the England riots, so let me just begin by recapping what happened. It started with the death of this man. So this is Mark Duggan, and he was shot dead by police in North London, which is a borough called Tottenham, the local football team. And Mark was shot dead on the 4th of August 2011 by police. And initially the story was that there was some kind of a firefight, that 2 bullets had been fired, and it was assumed that 1 bullet came from a gun he was carrying, and the 2nd bullet from a police officer. What later transpired was that both of the bullets came from the police-issued gun, so he hadn't taken out the weapon he was carrying. But Mark died instantly on the scene. And what happened after that is not that unusual when we have controversial deaths of this kind. It wasn't that unusual. There was a protest outside the police station. Family and friends of Mark gathered outside the police station asking for answers because they didn't know why he died. And then that turned violent. So that in itself, a protest over a controversial death that becomes violent, people start throwing bottles, attacking police cars, That in itself is not that unusual an occurrence. It happens every couple of years. What made the riots really unique and difficult to report was what happened subsequently. So after that initial spark in Tottenham, they spread. And the riots went from Tottenham to 6 miles north, a borough called Enfield, another area of London called Brixton on the second day. By the third night, there was a huge explosion of civil disorder, fighting, looting, attacks on police. So 26 of London's 30 boroughs were the scene of some quite intense disorder. Nothing had been seen like this since, I guess, the early 1980s in the UK. And some, actually, historians say that never before had we seen disorder on this scale and in this intensity. And after London, of course, it spread to Manchester and Birmingham and Liverpool and Nottingham and Gloucester. So large parts of the country, really, we were seeing civil disorder and civil unrest. And that's a really difficult event to report. Because if you had all of the journalists in the UK lined up on street corners, all of them working for the same media organisation, you still couldn't comprehensively tell the story of the riots. Because there was just too much happening. You know, several cities and in large parts of cities, and all of this was happening simultaneously. So it was, if you like, the crucible. It was the moment where we had the kind of ideal ingredients for an event to be told in a slightly different, new, I guess we might say modern way. And for people who were in their own homes and wanted to know what happened, what was happening, you know, suddenly they realised that there were new methods of communication available to them. So they didn't have to rely on the coincidence of having a national news reporter on their street corner. Some had that, but most, of course, didn't. They could just take to Twitter and search the name of their street, and suddenly there would be a feed of information from other people living around them, providing them insights into what was happening, photographs, video material. So from both ends, from the perspective of the journalist and the perspective, if you like, of the recipient of the information, it was a really unique and interesting experiment from which I think we learned a lot. So let me tell you how it began for me, as I open this bottle of water. So, first of all, there was a picture. And this is a picture from Tottenham, about 10-15 minutes after that protest over the death outside the police station turned violent. And this was, you know, every major news event now begins really through the lens of Twitter, because it's the fastest means of communication. Nothing can beat it in terms of speed. So any big event, you know, the death of bin Laden, you know, the bombing in Boston more recently, any major news event now is told first through Twitter. But it often doesn't begin in a clean way. It often begins in quite a complicated way, and an unverified way. So what does this picture show us? I mean, does anyone have any thoughts on what we can tell from this picture? What does this picture tell us? Yes? So it's car burns, yeah. I mean, you know, this was accompanied by words that were saying riots happening in Tottenham, but you know, there are no people there, so you can't see the rioting. Arguably, it was a crash. It was a car crash. Maybe it was a bank robbery that went wrong and they attacked the police car. Maybe it wasn't in Tottenham. Maybe it was a different part of London. Maybe it was in Tottenham, but it happened 2 years ago. Often with these big stories, people insert fabricated, fictionalized information. They Photoshop pictures. So you can't be sure. But what this was, I guess, a signifier. So whenever a story like this happens, it breaks, you as a journalist, people talk about verification and how you determine what's accurate and what's not. Well, you have to go there. You know, whenever I receive information from an online source, I always think, well, they're only an identity, only an online identity, until the point at which you meet them. And the same applies for an event that's happening. It's only a claim, it's a picture. It doesn't really exist until really the journalist gets there and verifies that it's happened. So I needed to find where this was happening in Tottenham. And the first thing I did was turn to Twitter and ask a question. So, does anyone have thoughts about this question? how effective this tweet is? Do you think I would have got good replies or bad replies? No replies? I did get replies. I did get some replies. This wasn't the best question I could have asked because it wasn't specific enough. Has anybody got advice? It's too open-ended a question. I wanted to know where specifically I should go. And this question elicited all sorts of different responses, such as, you know, wear a helmet, don't go, it's stupid, it's a riot, I don't believe it's a riot, I think that picture's false, all sorts of different things, but not really what I wanted, so I needed to be more specific. Now I quickly realised that, so I said, where exactly in Tottenham is the riot happening, the street name? And instantly, I had dozens of people responding with very specific information about where to go. And that was the first of hundreds of occasions in which I was asking for guidance through social media, and people were providing me very, very explicit, direct and useful information about where to go and how to report. Because if you're on the front line of a riot, often you don't know the wider context, you can't see it. Other people sometimes sat at home will know more than you do about other things that are happening. You can make mistakes, and you can be corrected. Sometimes your phone runs out of battery, and you need somebody to help you find a place where you can recharge it. There were times when my car was attacked, and somebody had to come and give me a lift. So reporting becomes a much more collaborative process. The reporter is no longer kind of working on their own, which was that kind of traditional mode of doing things, and is part of a wider crowd. It may be an online crowd, but it's a wider crowd. And if I was a journalist covering those riots I told you about in the early 1980s, or indeed, you know, the LA riots, or any other protest or civil disorder up until about 2008, 2009, and I wanted to know where the trouble was, where I should go, I would have followed plumes of smoke, or chased ambulances, or just arrived and asked around for help. But for 4 days and 4 nights, I was using this technique, and it meant I was always able to get to the scene of trouble, often before police had arrived. So it was extremely useful. And you know, the kind of reporting I did was really quite simple. You know, George Orwell used the phrase, something like, you know, never use a long word when a short one will do. And 140 characters forces you to use really quite direct, simple language. But social media and actually the ability for anybody to broadcast, which is what we have now in the world. You know, journalists used to have a monopoly over news. It was only us who had the means of producing it. We own the newspapers and the printing presses. Now suddenly that's been democratized. Everybody with access to a computer or phone can produce news, can record what's happening around them, and they can share it. And that's an equalizer. So my tweet is no different really to a tweet of any other bystander who's standing nearby. So the whole environment and the ecosystem has shifted somewhat. But I'm providing information, and then toward the end of the night, on the first night, I'm only showing you tweets from the very first night in Tottenham. As I said, it lasted 4 nights. The BBC pulled out one of their journalists because it was too dangerous. And what had actually happened was there was a group of reporters, and those of you who work as reporters will know that, you know, these big stories, we tend to congregate in one area. We tend to congregate usually around the satellite vans, the TV satellite vans. And there were a group of journalists congregating around one of these TV satellite vans, and some rioters ran past, and there was a police car nearby, and they threw petrol bombs at the police car. And it got really dangerous for the journalists who were there. So the BBC pulled out their journalists, and so did other reporters. So Sky News, all of the big live television networks pulled all their reporters out. And by this time I'd gone home, and I was watching it on television, and it was strange because it was because there were no reporters there, they were using pictures on loop from earlier on in the evening. So anybody who was watching what was happening on television was seeing what was happening 3 or 4 hours earlier. And then I looked at my computer screen, and I could see that, if anything, the disorder was intensifying. It was spreading, and more people were pouring into that area of London and ransacking loads of shops. But that didn't exist in the mainstream world. That only existed in social media. So I decided to go back out because clearly there was a void. And this is a terrible photograph. It was taken on a BlackBerry, but a BlackBerry phone. But you're doing some quite simple stuff. You're kind of, if you like, you're doing a kind of simple, straightforward reporting job, the same reporting job that journalists have been doing for centuries. But building in North London ablaze, and young men had kind of formed cordons along the road to stop people from getting past, and they were stopping cars, and they wouldn't let me get any closer because there's a furniture store that's on fire. And then later in the night, in a slightly different part of London, 20 people running around with hands filled with looted goods, and they're fighting each other to try to get the goods. And then there's a teenager in a minicab that he's just stolen, driving along the pavement. It was like a scene from Ghostbusters. And then later, 70 young people breaking into clothes, mobile phone and electric shops, and some were filling suitcases. So some were turning up with their suitcases, filling as much as they could, and going away. And it's quite when I talk about it, I place myself back in that position. It's a remarkable moment. You know, when you see these things on television, they look terrifying. They look very scary. But when you're there, there's a kind of carnivalesque atmosphere. It feels like a festival. People are laughing and shouting and joking and having a good time. It's like, in their words, shopping for free. You know, the law has been suspended and we can get whatever we want. And there were no police there. So not only were there no journalists there, but there were no police there either. So at the end of that first night in Tottenham, I remember going home about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And I'd begun the riots with about 7,000 or 8,000 followers, which for a journalist isn't bad. And overnight, and this happened, of course, don't forget, in the early hours of the morning, when most people you would think would be asleep, I'd accumulated an extra 11,000 followers. But to call them followers is not really accurate, because these weren't just people who were passively consuming what I was telling them. They were co-collaborators. So they were answering me back. They were involved in a conversation with me as the night went on. So I had a different relationship to those people than a normal reporter would, just providing an article that is read by anonymous people subsequently. So then the question becomes, you know, these people have been following me, you, if you like, have activated this online community, people have gathered around. How can you then exploit that community? How can you use those people who've helped you? And how can they help you back? And the answer is, you know, manifold, really. So the next morning, I wake up about 10 o'clock in the morning, and I say I'm writing a piece reconstructing the riot. Has anyone seen a record of what precise time the BBC pulled out its journalists? And just to explain here, this is what journalists always do. You know, we're writing a long piece, a kind of 2,000-word feature that tells the story of what was then. By this point it hadn't spread. By then it was just the Tottenham riot. So the story of the Tottenham riot from the beginning to the end, I want a detailed narrative. You know, I'm writing a piece of nice writing. This is what I'm doing here. And the element about the time the BBC pulled out its journalists, that's not a big story. You know, it's just one tiny sentence within a wider article. But if I was to phone up the BBC press office and say, what time did you pull out your journalists? They would suspect I was writing a negative story. They would say, well, maybe we'll tell you, but we'll call you back in 2 or 3 hours. I wasn't writing a negative story. As I said, it was just a short line to say at 1:32 a.m. the BBC and Sky pulled out its journalists because it became too dangerous. So rather than ask the BBC or phone up the police, who had other things to do, better things to do than try to find out when the BBC pulled out its journalists, I just tweeted it. And you know, that crowd that had amassed around me the previous night now wanted to help me back. So they did some quite interesting things to find out the precise time the BBC pulled out its journalists. They looked at photographs from the scene. They tried to find the Flickr accounts of BBC journalists and BBC producers and cameramen to work out the exact time by looking at the timestamps that they left. And because of all of this discussion, all of this kind of mini investigation that's happens in the trail of a thread, it's transparent. I can see how they came to the conclusion that they did. It's kind of a mini crowdsourced initiative. And I show you not because it was particularly significant. This is just kind of one tiny episode, but it gives you an illustration of how we were using this technology through the riots. One, to broadcast, provide people information about what's happening from the ground, but then subsequently to receive information as well, and to work collaboratively with people to better tell the story. Another example, I wanted to know the exact time the bus was being torched. So after that police car was attacked and in flames, a group of rioters, we spoke to them later, went up to one of London's famous red buses and stopped the bus and told all the passengers to come off, quite politely, and they said, we're going to burn the bus. And the passengers came off and they set fire to the bus. And I wanted to know again what time that was. I mean, not because it's a big story, just because within the article I want to say, you know, 8:30 p.m. they torched the bus. But how can I be sure it was 8:30 p.m.? And you know, again, what they did here was really interesting. People started really forensically examining all of the publicly available material to find out what time the bus was torched. So they managed to find passengers who were on the bus and asked them. They managed to find photographs of the bus. And there's a way you can get the EXIF data from the photograph to look at the exact time it was taken. And then among themselves, they were having debates about the different timestamps on the different photographs, pointing out some of these photographs must have been taken by a tourist because they were on a different time zone. And eventually they got to the truth, which was something like 8:37 p.m. So again, it's a kind of mini example of crowdsourcing, and it cuts out time for me. You know, I'm quite tired. I spent the previous night up all night reporting the riots. It's never easy writing long stories when you're tired. You haven't got time to do all of this research often. I have to file this story in 3 or 4 hours' time. And it cuts out that time. It helps me work more quickly. And then people start providing me more information. So once I think, as a journalist, you've established yourself with some degree of credibility within an online community, what happens then is people want to volunteer you information. So you don't even have to ask. You don't even have to ask for people to send you stuff like this. So people are saying, on the Sunday, so Tottenham was on Saturday, the next day, they say, look, pictures from Enfield, and they link to some photographs to Enfield, and look, there's some kind of disturbance. And this was really major. This is significant. Suddenly, this riot within one borough of Tottenham, one neighbour, in one neighbourhood of Tottenham, is beginning to spread. So it's a significant moment, and people are alerting me to the fact that it's beginning to spread. So there's advantages there without even asking. Once you've kind of established yourself, I think there's a kind of gravity that people want to help. So a lot of this, I think, is about adaptation. So, you know, I mean, I started at The Guardian 8 years ago, and then Twitter didn't exist, Facebook was in its embryonic phase. I didn't realise that I would have to change and neither did my colleagues in the dramatic way that we do. But all we're really doing is adapting a quite traditional mode of working to slightly new technologies. And actually, to call it technology is somewhat confusing, I think, because, you know, the thing to understand about social media is the social aspect of it, rather than the kind of technological aspect of it, which isn't particularly complicated. You know, it's a form of instant messaging. And if you want to succeed, you need to succeed socially rather than technologically. But there are other technologies that emerge as well. So in the middle of the riots, you know, it was clear that we, yes, please, good question, yeah.
Do you get much of some kind of false information from your collaboration? Maybe somebody even tries to feed you some false information on purpose, just trying to get it on the news and stuff?
Yes, that's a very good question. And we did receive false information. There's a section at the end of the presentation when I'm going to talk to you about that. That's a really good question. Ways in which both, I hope to cover ways in which both we can try to avoid being misled by false information, but also how other people are resolving those inaccuracies as well. So look, I'm talking here about adapting technologies, and as I was about to say, there was a point in the riots when it became clear to me that rioters themselves, the people who were responsible for these crimes, were not using Twitter and they were not using Facebook. They were using a different kind of technology of which I knew nothing. And it revolved around one of these, BlackBerry. Now, I don't know if this is the same in Finland, but in the UK, in 2011, pretty much all teenagers had BlackBerries. And I know that sounds strange, because they're kind of the handset of businessmen, or they used to be in the early 2000s. But they're the cheapest smartphone you could buy. And there was a really good deal by which you could pay £5 a month and had unlimited messaging. The other thing that BlackBerries have, and I think this is a technology that emerged from the need for businessmen to have very confidential and discreet communications, is encrypted messaging. So there's a thing called BBM, BlackBerry Messenger, and it enables you to communicate with other BlackBerry holders encrypted. So these communications cannot be read by police, by law enforcement, by anybody in the public. They're entirely encrypted. And I know for a fact that police, even if they have a warrant, they don't have the technology to actually read these encrypted messages. So it became evident quite early on that one thing that rioters were doing was using this technology to organise and incite. And it was fascinating because gradually it dawned on us that what they were doing was essentially kind of creating flash mobs in different parts of London and different parts of other cities, where they would say, let's meet at this place at this time, and suddenly you would be there and you would see gradually more and more people emerge with scarves and masks and sometimes weapons. And in the space of 5 to 10 minutes, the crowd grows from 100 to 1,000, and there were no police, because police didn't anticipate they would be there. And once the threshold was big enough, they attack a shop, and then the rioting begins. And that's kind of how it was happening. So the question for me as a journalist then is, how do we get onto this technology? The same way as we need to migrate to a new technology of Twitter, because that's how our users want to consume our news. How do we migrate to this technology? Well, the first thing you need to do is buy a BlackBerry, which is what we did very quickly. We bought a BlackBerry, and then I created a blog post. And I said in this blog post that if anybody's receiving these BBM messages, which are being passed around hundreds of thousands of people, their BlackBerries are beeping, and they're seeing these messages saying, I'll meet you outside Croydon train station, 6 o'clock, or everybody let's meet outside this shoe shop. So if anyone's receiving these messages from their brothers or their families or friends or school friends, can you pass them on to us? And here's my if you want to be part of this circle of BlackBerry communication, you need two things. You need a BlackBerry name, which I put here as my name is Paul, and then you need a code. And my code is 22416EC1. So I just put that blog post out, purchased a BlackBerry, and then suddenly we started receiving all these communications. And here's one. And this was a really popular one on the second day. It says, everyone in Edmonton, Enfield, Wood Green, these are all different neighbourhoods in North London, everywhere in North, link up at Enfield Town Station, 4 o'clock sharp. Start leaving your yards, that means your area, and linking up with your niggers. Duck the feds, that's an Americanisation, it means shoot the police. Bring your ballies, that's your balaclavas, and your bags, trolleys, cars, vans, hammers, the lot. Keep sending this round to Bearman, send this to lots of people, keep passing it along the chain. Make sure no snitch boys get this, that means don't pass it on to any journalists. Whatever ends you're from, put your balaclavas on, link up everywhere and cause havoc, just rob everything. Police can't stop it. Dead the fires though, so it means no fires. Rebroadcast again, pass it along the chain. And I think that's a kind of interesting message. I mean, this is one of hundreds that were going around, but I show you this because it was the most popular. And this was on the second day, so when Tottenham was about to spread. The thing I find most interesting about this message is the second to last line that says, dead the fires though, stop fires. So even though it seems like depraved, absent of any morals or any ethical code, inciting really serious violence, there's still a line there that says, let's not start any fires. Which is curious, at the very least. But the point is, this message and all these other messages like them that we were receiving on BlackBerry messaging, enabled us to be one step ahead. So we get this message, it says meet up at 4 o'clock sharp. We got this in the morning, so we decided to be in Enfield at 4 o'clock sharp. And we were there, and then I remember very vividly, people were kind of knocking down walls to get the bricks, preparing for an attack on police. And there were very few police officers in the area. And the crowd got bigger, and then it was about 9 o'clock, eventually, that something happened. When a breaking news story happens, the fastest means of communicating it is just by sending a tweet. Breaking means kind of breaking news. So I say serious clashes now in Enfield. Around 200 teenagers broke into a jewellery store, police dogs and baton attacks. And this was a really significant juncture. Again, this was the moment that riot in Tottenham, localised to one neighbourhood, began to spread. So this is when the country really started to get nervous. So to be able to announce that to the world is really significant journalistically. And for people who say, well, you're doing this, but what does The Guardian get out of this? You're not publishing on The Guardian. No, but you're bringing a huge amount of attention to a Guardian reporter who passes people on to Guardian content. And you're establishing yourself in terms of credibility. But thirdly, if you don't do it, then someone else will. Either a journalist from a rival news organisation or just someone else who's there. So there's no real choice in it. I think if you're there, you have to be first, and you have to tweet first. But it's a layer, and that's the key, because if we were just exclusively reporting via 140-character mechanism, then yes, admittedly, it would be shallow. You can't provide the context, you can't provide the nuance or the depth that you can in an article. You can't provide the kind of that vivid power that you can communicate via video. But this isn't all we were doing, and I think it's important. So people who are watching this, they see that tweet, and then they see another very bad photograph posted by me that shows the aftermath. There's a few police officers standing around, and this is like the outer layer of the onion. You get more detail the further in you go, and then there's a blog post which provides a bit more information, a bit more detail, and all of this, of course, is done from a mobile phone on the scene. And then I can just post a video, so I can show you. People have seen the tweet, they've seen the photograph of the aftermath, they've seen the blog post, and then I can just show them what I saw. Holding up my camera. And this is no different to any video anybody else would have shot, and it's not broadcast quality. So, of course, then at the end of the week we have a much more detailed piece, the traditional form of news journalism that we're all used to, where we can go into lavish detail about what happened during the week of the riots, a kind of big 6,000-word feature. But my feeling is that for anybody who sat down on, a few days later, on Saturday afternoon, reading this 6,000-word feature, if they have seen the video and they saw the blog post, and more importantly, if they were seeing my tweets as I was reporting from the ground, and actually if they were answering me and providing me with advice and helping to tell me where to go, then they would have a different relationship with that traditional news content at the end of the week. It wouldn't just feel like they were reading a standard news story with an anonymous byline. And they would feel different towards it. There were times when it was a really kind of emotional roller coaster. People really did massively improve the way I personally could report this story. Now, I remember one occasion very vividly because it wasn't far from my house in East London. And it was the one time I think I personally saw a police officer nearly killed. He was in a police car, and the police car was near this estate called the Pembury Estate. And rioters had pretty much taken over this estate, and they'd owned it for about 3 or 4 hours. And they started throwing rocks at this police car. And I think they presumed the police car was empty. And I presumed the police car was empty. And then suddenly it started to reverse. And the crowd realised there's somebody inside. And within 10, 15 seconds, the crowd had encircled this car, trying to open the door. There was someone on the roof with a big chunk of concrete trying to smash the windscreen. And I just thought, any second now, this officer's going to die. and somehow he managed to drive off. I mean, he could have killed somebody by driving off. He crashed into a lamppost and then carried on driving. And at that point, 5–10 minutes after that, there was a police helicopter overhead, and it was almost like an army had descended on the Pembrey estate. I mean, clearly the police had radioed through to the commanders and said, we need reinforcements. And there were just hundreds of police officers arriving. And the rioters ran away. And I remember seeing them running across a park. And they were chased by police on horseback. And it was just across the park, and then they're just melting into the horizon. And if I was a journalist reporting these riots 7 or 8 years ago, how do I find out where they've gone? Do I chase them? Do I run after the police horses and the rioters? Do I phone up the police press office and ask them where they think the rioters have gone? Or do I do that thing, as I said before, following the plumes of smoke, or just guessing? Well, the answer is I could instantly tweet, where have the rioters gone in Hackney? And the response I had from that was just immense, because so many people were following me who were local in Hackney, who were too scared to come out of their house. They could smell the smoke, they could hear what was happening, and they could look out of their windows and they said, look, the crowd is gathering on Kingsland Road. So I could go to Kingsland Road, and that was another element where you had shop owners coming out to defend their shops. So at every stage I could be one step ahead of the story, not through any achievement on my part, but because so many people were willing to collaborate and help me report. So look, but by the end of the riots, I'd amassed more followers, which was great, and I had, I think, by then about 45,000. So it's gone from 8,000 to 45,000. It's quite a significant jump. But sometimes people who are in the right place at the right time get these surge of followers. It happens every now and then. If there's a crash outside Haaga-Helia right now, a bus crash, and someone's tweeting it, that person will accumulate 2,000 or 3,000 followers. And that's very nice. But the thing that I'm showing you here is a table of the most retweeted accounts during the riots. So the 8 most retweeted accounts during the riots. And I'm showing you partly because maybe I'm bragging and I'm very proud that I'm number 2. But I think we can deduce something from this list. I think it tells us something about what succeeds in social media. Yeah, question. Wow, good catch.
Okay, so did you count your working hours during the riots?
No, why do you ask?
That's because I'm a working journalist and I use Twitter, but not so much. And it wonders me, how can you make a difference between your working hours and your free time? If you're on Twitter and something happens, then you have to stop everything you're doing and start working.
Look, that's a very good question. And well, first thing to say is, in answer to the question, I was working round the clock. It was nocturnal, so I would start working normally during the riots about 8 o'clock in the evening, and work through till 8 o'clock in the morning. And I didn't claim overtime. We don't get paid overtime. I should have said this at the beginning, my job is it's a kind of blend of doing editing and writing, but I tend not to do on-the-ground reporting. But this was such a huge story that I felt like I really wanted to do it. It was a big story. But I think the point you make is a broader one, which is about when we're working and when we're not working. And are our Twitter accounts personal accounts or are they professional accounts? And that's a blurred question, and there's no standard answer to it. There's a whole human psychological side to all of this. There's a whole side of this about our personal relationships with our girlfriends, boyfriends, wives and husbands. We're constantly playing on our phones, and when we stop and when we don't stop. I think people who are probably 32 and under have never really experienced the world before, where when you went home after work at 6 o'clock, it kind of stopped. All I will say is I think that it's impossible to function in this way if you're not working in your part-time, and also if you're not a person. And this is the point I wanted to make from this list, which is, look at this list. The number 4, number 5, number 6, and number 7, these are corporate accounts. So they have millions and millions of followers. several million, probably tens of millions something, at BBC Breaking and at Guardian. But they're corporate fees. So they kind of provide quite anodyne, short, sharp references to their stories. They're not people. So even though they had millions and millions more followers, I had, say, 45,000, they were retweeted less, so they had arguably less influence. Fewer people endorsed them or engaged with them. And I think that tells us something, as I said before, about what succeeds in social media, that it's people rather than corporate accounts that work. And if you want your account to succeed, then you have to be a person. And a person has opinions and views, so that's a big step for many journalists who want to be detached from the story, for those who believe in objectivity. And a person gets tired, and a person complains when they've got yogurt in their hair because someone threw a yogurt pot at them in the middle of a riot. But this makes people laugh. It makes people feel they can relate to that individual. So, at Piers Morgan. Now, Piers Morgan is a former tabloid editor from the UK, and now he works in the United States. He's the new Larry King. He was just reporting from the States. He wasn't even in the UK. But his tweets were so personalised that he was very successful. I've told you about me. What's really interesting is number one. Because what people sometimes say to me is, well, look, you have your pre-existing credibility as a Guardian journalist. Of course people follow you. Of course people trusted you during the riots. That you had a head start. And I think that's true. But number one is very interesting, because number one was an account that didn't exist at the beginning of the riots. It had 0 followers. And it was just a guy who was living in West London who, in the midst of all the trouble, decided he wanted to try to orchestrate the clean-up. So he wanted people to come out of their houses in organised fashion with brooms and clean up all of the mess, all of the debris. And he did it in a very effective way. He worked around the clock. He was organising communities across England. And he became the most retweeted account during the riots. I think that's quite interesting in itself. Does anyone have any other questions? Yes?
Yes, hello. I was wondering, how in practice do you manage all those followers? I mean, you're just one person, and back then you had 30,000 followers, and right now you seem to have 55,500 followers. I mean, if you ask a question and you get 2,000 responses, how do you filter that? How do you manage that?
You're really popular. No. It's a good question. There are certain questions that you get to know the kind of questions that work. And this applies, this has always been the case for journalists, that, over time, experience matters a lot, and you realise what questions work when you're interviewing a source. Say you work in politics and you interview politicians. The most effective question you can ask a politician. Certain questions, it's no point, because they'll just start talking about their PR strategy. And the same with this, there's questions, open-ended questions can elicit too many responses, but if you're very specific, then you'll get far fewer and probably more valuable responses. I mean, it's important to stress here, somebody earlier asked about verification, and I'm going to come on to verification shortly, but with none of this was I saying, if I said, where is the trouble happening in Birmingham? I'm in a car, I'm on a motorway, I'm travelling to Birmingham City. Can someone give me the postal code for the area of most trouble? And I would get 2 or 3 dozen responses. And you can see from that, 2/3 of them say the same area. Now, I'm not at that point going to phone up my editor and say, all of the trouble is in this place, because Twitter's telling me. And neither am I going to tweet, according to people who are responding to me, this particular area, Sparkbrook or Broad Street, the areas of Birmingham where the rioting is happening, because I don't know that. So you can trust information to a different degree. I will allow that information to direct me to a certain area, because in the past it's proven correct. But I won't endorse that information, because I'm not entirely sure I can trust it yet, unless it comes from a source or account that I know and that I trust. Yes?
If you have like a hectic writing news place, how do you have time to follow the Twitter there, where everything is happening?
Yeah, how do you have the time when you're in the middle of a riot to follow your account? That's a good point, and often you don't. I mean, all of this is hard work, of course, but there's people in this room who have covered tough, difficult stories, and you know that you get adrenaline from it, and you feel like you're riding a wave, and it becomes quite an exciting experience. And that carries you through.
Just by the time consuming part, like you have that many followers, and you know they are talking about these events on Twitter, and you are there, and then you know you can't do two things at the same time.
You're right. You just do the best you can. I mean, you ignore a large number. I mean, I was ignoring a large number. And this is just one example, because this is a very intense example. You know, we're talking about a riot here, when there are going to be lots and lots of replies. The truth is, for other types of stories, when you apply this model of journalism to other types of stories, you're not going to be inundated and engulfed. But yes, you're right. When you are, you end up ignoring a lot, I guess. I mean, I remember going back to my office. I'd left my office on the Friday, and I didn't go back into the office until the Thursday morning. So in that period, the riots had happened. And I left my computer on with my with a web browser open with my Twitter. And it told me all of the replies I'd had throughout that period. And it was 17,000. So, of course, there's no chance, there's no possible way in which I could have read them all. I probably read about 10-15% of them. But they, nonetheless, those that I did read were really useful. And you're just scrolling down and suddenly something pops up that's useful. Okay, well look, we've talked about the reporting side of things. I said to you at the beginning that the second half of the presentation was going to be more about the kind of investigative element, trying to work out what happened during the riots. So that's what we're going to move on to now. So, what was quite, I think, relatively, not easy, but what we thought we'd done quite well at was reporting what had happened. So, you know, the very first thing that journalists can do is provide what famously called a first rough draft of history. You know, what has happened? You're describing what has happened. You're trying to, in a way that's not too sensational, but at the same time not too boring, describe what has happened in a kind of comprehensive way. So that was something that we were doing when the riots were happening, describing what. What's always more difficult, and journalists get nervous, I think, about doing this, and probably rightly nervous, is describing why. We can do the what, but why? And this is an incredibly contested question. There was dispute about why all of these people had come out onto the streets and caused all of this unrest and disorder. We knew that the spark was the death of Mark Duggan in Tottenham, but what we didn't know was why it had then spread across London and then across the country. That was a really difficult question. Why? And you know, the answer at the time was really rather predictable. So the first thing the government said is, we're not going to hold a public inquiry. You can argue about why they would not want to hold a public inquiry. Some people might say that, you know, public inquiries tell government officials what they don't want to hear. You know, if the public inquiry says the riots happened for X, Y, or Z, then you need to do something about it. They didn't want that. They said this was sheer criminality. We don't need an explanation. So in that void, there were some rather predictable assumptions, and it tended to follow the kind of political inclinations of the people who were making them. So people on the right wing, were saying, you know, it's a breakdown in family relations, too many single parents. Or they were blaming this on rap culture. You know, music, hip-hop from the States is kind of influencing our youth. And on the left wing, you know, equally, I would argue, equally kind of unreliable theories about the riots. People were saying, these weren't riots, these were protests against the impending austerity cuts, you know, the financial crisis. Or they were saying that this is culture, this is a different kind of culture. It's not rap culture, it's the kind of cultural mindset that we've inherited from bankers or from MPs who have fiddled their expenses. But none of these theories seem to have much accuracy. None of them really were based on any evidence. They were based upon the thoughts of people who watched the riots on television. So there was no evidence. And one thing I kind of really wanted to do, I was kind of passionate about, was trying to gather some hard, reliable evidence that would tell us something about why the riots had happened. And as well as being very interested in kind of the future of journalism and all this kind of stuff, I like to read a lot journalism from the past. I think we can learn a lot from it, particularly investigative journalism. And I found a link to a report into the Detroit riots in 1967. And the Detroit riots were the deadliest riots in modern US history. It's like 66 people died, something like that. A lot of people, more severe than the riots we had in England. And it was interesting because after those riots, we had a similar situation. No one knew when it happened. There were different ideas. Some people blamed it on people from the south of the United States who migrated north to Detroit and somehow were kind of detached and they didn't feel part of the community and therefore they rioted. That was the common assumption. But there was no evidence. And a newspaper teamed up with a local university and they created a research study. So it's a kind of piece of sociology. And they hired a bunch of black teachers. This was during the school holidays. And they sent the teachers out into the community. And they said, we want you to interview members of the community to find out why these riots happened. So we thought that was a really interesting model. And I got hold of the study from 1967. And it's a product of history. The methodology they were using back in 1967 was a kind of now ancient form of sociology. It was very quantitative, survey-style questions. They didn't speak to a large number of people, but in essence what they did was very interesting. In essence, they tried to gather evidence. They tried to find information from people who were either there or were in the vicinity to try to work out why all of this happened. And I phoned up the professor. He was a journalist at the time, and then he became a professor who ran this study in Detroit. And he was, I think he's probably in his late 80s or early 90s, a guy called Phil Mayer. And I said, look, we want to do something similar in the UK. Have you got any advice? And he said, the things that you need, firstly, you need a very good academic partner. So if you as a journalist are going to try to do something a bit innovative and work in partnership with an academic, you need a really good academic partner. And secondly, you need quite a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of pounds. So the latter bit really scared me because journalists don't have lots of money, as you know. The Guardian has, maybe I shouldn't say this, but minus 40 million a year, pretty much. So we're loss making. And don't ask me to come up with a business model that will save journalism because that's not what I'm here to do. But we didn't have money and we needed an academic partner. So the first thing we did was try to find that. And we thought, well, we'll go to the London School of Economics, which is the best kind of research institution in the UK, and say, what we want to do is fuse our kind of mutual abilities. So academics are very good at doing kind of rigorous research, doing a piece of analysis that is sufficiently well confined and well done that people trust it. But it will take a year or 2 years for you to do this, maybe 3 years to do a big academic study. What we as journalists can do is speed, and we can provide momentum, and we can use our a certain degree of savvy, instinct. Journalists are good at convincing people to talk, and the people who were responsible for the riots, were at this stage anonymous. No one had actually spoken to anything. This is 1, 2 or 3 weeks after the riots. No one had spoken to the people who'd broken into the shops. And of course, they didn't want to talk because they'd committed some quite serious crimes. They didn't want to go to prison. 4,000 people were arrested in total. They didn't want to go to prison, so they had no real incentive to talk. But journalists are good at finding people and convincing them to talk. So why don't we marry the academics and the journalists? And a guy called Professor Tim Newburn, who runs the social policy department at the London School of Economics, said yes. He got on board straight away. And then we got some funding from 2 foundations. One was the Open Society Foundations, and the other was the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And they gave us basically sufficient money to launch this study, which we called Reading the Riots. And then we had to run a bloody research study, which was a daunting part, and we had to do it quickly. So we decided if this is going to have impact, and that's the other thing, by the way, when I was talking to Tim, trying to persuade him to come on board, I didn't just say, look, as journalists, we're good at finding people and convincing them to talk. I also said, look, Tim, you could spend 2 years working on an academic study and nobody will notice. I don't mean to be mean, that's no criticism of you, but you'll come up with this big, you can write a book or several journal articles, and if you get something in the press, it will be like a kind of 250-word article, which will misrepresent your findings. By doing this, you kind of cut out that. We are your method of publication. And in terms of impact, nothing can beat it, because we have front pages. We can do a series of articles in the newspaper. We can run stuff on the web. We can contact senior politicians, the Home Secretary, judges. We can make sure this has impact. So Tim liked the idea, and the foundations liked the idea, and we launched the study. And the very first thing we needed to do was first of all, come up with a schedule. And if we wanted the impact, it had to be done quickly. So we thought 4 months for the first part of the study. 4 months to find people, 4 months since the riot, so actually we're talking 3 months. 3 months to hire researchers, create an academic study, find people who were directly involved in the riots, convince them to talk, conduct kind of confidential interviews that might last an hour or two, transcribe all of those interviews, and have enough analysts on site to analyse all of those interviews in the collective, and then come up with some findings, and then publish them. And then the second phase, after that, we want to speak to the other people. So the most important thing is the rioters, the people who are responsible for this, and then after that we can think about, police officers, interviewing police officers, and judges, and victims of the riots, because they matter as well, and lawyers. So 2 phases, one in 4 months, and the second one 4 months after that. So the whole thing done in 8 months. The first thing we needed to do was hire those researchers, and we could afford 30. So we could afford 30 people, and these were some of the people we got on board. And it was an interesting process, because we put an application online. We said, look, this is the study. We called it Reading the Riots. We want to find out the causes and consequences of the England riots, and we need researchers to go out into the community and interview people. And we had hundreds of applications, and we interviewed 60 of them to decide who we wanted, and we hired 30. And it was an interesting process, because if we wanted just journalists, we could have got 30 journalists. And we probably, if we wanted just academics, we could have got 30 academics who are used to doing academic interviews. But actually, we wanted to try something a bit different. Because the first thing about this study is that with this speed, it was going to be very hard convincing people to come on board. So we wanted these researchers to have good links with the community. They had to come from these communities. If they were going to get people to trust them, they needed to be there already. They needed to have one reason why people might trust them. And we also, of course, we needed them to have experience of interviewing. You know, journalists are not the only people who can interview. Other people do interviews, counsellors do interviews, mentors do interviews. So these people behind me were a real mix of people. You know, we had teachers, we had a boxing gym instructor. One of the people was a taxi driver who, for some reason, years earlier had worked for a local authority interviewing people. We had all sorts of people. I mean, the youngest was a 17-year-old who massively impressed us. And the oldest was a 68-year-old who'd once been in prison and came from a particularly important area of the country. So these were we took a bit of a risk, but these were the people who were going to go out, find people, and interview them. And you know, of course, we provided some training. And it's funny, the training for the interviewing is the thing I learned most from. I learned most from learning how you interview as part of a kind of piece of social research, sociological interviewing. Because you know, journalists can sometimes, this is my conclusion now, can sometimes be the worst interviewers. Now, we phone people up with a pre-existing idea of what we want them to say. We know, when we phone, we know the quote we want them to give us. And often we even know where in the article we want to put that quote. Now, this is going to be great, because this comes at the end. Well, you know, this is a lawyer who's pro this, so I want her or him to say this. And then we kind of get, hello, how are you, how's the weather? And then we get the conversation to the point where we want them to say what we want them to say. So we lead them to the place where we want them to be. And this form of interviewing is completely different. Now, this form of interviewing, you have to detach yourself. And you cannot let your own biases influence where the interviewer takes you. So it's non-leading. It's a neutral form of questioning in which You never ask a question that will answer yes or no, and you never try to lead somebody. So rather than say, did you steal that pair of trainers because you hated the government? You say, why did you steal that pair of trainers? And if the response isn't good enough, you say, well, can you explain a bit more? So you never direct them, you always just nod them and prod them, encourage them to speak more loudly. So that meant the interviews went on for hours, but it also meant that the responses were really interesting. And in total, we interviewed 270 rioters. And as you can see from the map, most of them were in London, where most of the disorder was, but they were also in Manchester and Liverpool, Salford, Nottingham, Birmingham. So our researchers did a really good job. In 1 month, we had 1 month of field work. In total, we interviewed 270 people. So this instantly became the largest research study into the riots. And then came the period of analysis. So we transcribed all of these interviews, and then we put them into a database. And we needed a home-built database. And my newspaper, a couple of years earlier, got the WikiLeaks cables. Remember those cables, the Iraq war logs and all the rest of it? And it was we had to build a homemade database to sort all of this complex information. So we used the same homemade database to sort these interviews. And we had 5 LSE analysts. When we did a word count, it was 1.3 million words. So that's several novels, 10 or 12 books worth, of first-person account, of first-person testimony from people who were there and who were responsible for the disorder. And then they needed to sift it and sort it. And again, the one thing that journalists are not very good at doing is when you have your interview, which is probably badly done, then you don't think, what does this interview tell me? I want to represent it in the best possible fashion. You take from the interview the thing that is useful to you, the thing that you believe is relevant. Now the analysis of these interviews is very different. You need a holistic approach. So they went through every single interview and coded them. They themed particular sections and took those themes and put them in a separate database and then coded them. And then suddenly you have this kind of building picture where each time you analyse another interview, you get another layer of texture, another layer of information. So at the end of this process, we had, as I said, dozens of findings. Now I'm not, because this is a talk about journalism, not a talk about what caused the riots, I'm not going to give you a detailed description of the findings. But some of the things that we could do were quite interesting. So we asked people where they lived and where they rioted, and we tried to get their journey. So this is a map of the blue are men, and you'll see suddenly some yellow dots as well, women. People's journeys from their home to the riots and where they rioted in the city. Now that's London. You can see in London, they're rioting all over the city, in the suburbs, different parts of the city. There was no real congregation in the centre. In Birmingham and all of the other cities, people tended to, generally speaking, come from the outskirts and congregate in the middle where there were many shops. This is Liverpool. So people start from the outside and then they congregate in the middle. So these were some of the kind of things that we managed to do. And there were, I say dozens of findings. There really were whole dimensions to this research study. The first phase was published over a whole week. 20,000 words worth of journalism, I guess, and videos and pictures and interactive graphics. But there was one thing for which the study will always be remembered, which is the front page of the very first story on the very first day we released the findings, because it proved highly controversial. And the conclusion was that, well, let me ask you, what does that headline say? I mean, the headline says, you know, blame the police, it's the police that were at fault. Why rioters say they took part. And it was a really disappointing moment for me. It was a point when I thought, you know what, journalism isn't that great, because you have to simplify. And you always have to simplify. That's what kind of journalism often means. You know, you take a complex subject and you make it simple enough for people to understand. But with a headline, you really have to simplify. Shorter even than the 140 character tweets. And we had to take this whole research study and basically summarise it in a headline. And we're saying blame the police, why the rioters took part. And that's because what they told us was that in all of these communities where the rioting had happened, there was a frustration with the way police treated certain members of the community. And that frustration often revolved around what we call stop and search. So it's when individuals are stopped in the street and they're searched, they're not given a reason why they're searched, and then the photograph is often taken. And people were telling us this happens on a daily basis, often several times a day. So I can't leave my house and walk down to the shops and see my friend and then come back to my house without being stopped several times. Do you know how that makes me feel? And when they started talking about the experiences of this, and particularly, very interestingly, from people who were responsible for riots, saying police are not impolite, they're incivil, they don't treat us with respect, it's the way in which they speak to us that we find so frustrating. You start to get a bit of a feeling for where they were coming from. Now, I'm not endorsing their view, and this is why our headline became so controversial, because people said, you're justifying the riots. You're providing a kind of an excuse. And we responded, well, no, we're not. We're trying to provide an explanation. It's different. Explaining is different to justifying. And all we're doing is conveying to you, we're the messengers, conveying to you what these rioters told us. And in large part, what looked on your television screens like entirely mindless, directionless rioting that had no possible conceivable explanation, for the people who were doing it, it was revenge. You know, they saw it as war against the police. And that was one of the kind of key findings. And, you know, my mind was open to, I guess, a different way of thinking about these community relations between police and certain individuals. And I think, believe, hope, our study did something toward changing the way senior politicians and also senior police officers think about community relations. And there have been a number of reforms in London and elsewhere since we ran this study. But it was controversial. And it, you know, one of the reasons it was controversial was because it painted the police in a pretty negative light. And that was, made me slightly nervous, because the police had done quite a lot to keep the peace where they could, to protect these communities. And arguably, it was the police ultimately that prevented the disorder from spreading beyond those 4 days. So then we came to the second part, which was interviews with police. And actually, if I'm honest with you, many of our interviewers who interviewed these rioters, the experience of interviewing them and hearing their stories about their daily encounters with nasty police officers, being stopped and searched, being beaten up, having drugs put in their back pocket, made our interviewers quite anti-police. It's natural. They were human. And not all of them, but some of them, I think, probably came away from that with views that were somewhat, I wouldn't say hostile, but somewhat critical of many police officers. And then these same interviewers went to interview the police officers. And after the very first day of interviewing the police officers, I saw them come back into the office. They'd changed entirely, because they had seen the other side. And we interviewed in total 130 police officers, which is unprecedented, across the country. And we were able to see, we could take one incident, say for example, a branch of Curry's, an electrical store in Brixton, being raided, being looted. And we could take that incident and we could describe it from the perspective of 3 or 4 rioters, and then the perspective of 3 or 4 police officers. And it makes you realise you have to see a story in its kaleidoscopic entirety. Because after interviewing the police, we got a very different story, not just of why the riots were caused or how they were caused, but what a life-threatening experience policing the riots was. In fact, we did record some of our interviews, and we put them in a kind of short video. And I'm going to play that to you now. It's police officers speaking from their own perspective about what it was like to be there on the front line.
Home. At Grassroad, it's dark, it's pitch black, it's late on in the evening. and you just see she gets dressed in black and towards you, and you know what they're going to do.
There was probably 100 youths, and they were throwing anything that they could get their hands on.
Between machetes, golf clubs, wheelie bins on fire, bottles, etc.
Everything that could be found, that could be thrown, as was thrown.
Fridge freezer pulled out of the shop.
Gardens were being stripped, walls were being broken up because they'd run out of missiles.
I was knocked unconscious. I fell to my knees, fell forward. I mean, literally the lights went out. I saw stars. And the next thing I remember was being hauled up back onto my feet by two officers either side of me. There was no other option but to carry on.
They come to my sergeant's window, a paving slab went at the window, and I thought the woman was going through. There's no two ways about it. I thought she's going to get seriously hurt.
A brick had actually come through the window. My colleague was holding a kind of handle to try and keep his door shut. He then screamed, "I'm being attacked." This machete had just appeared through this hole in the window, and it just started hacking at his hand.
We got a call on the way that an officer was captured in a burning car, and this officer was calling for help. I had to make a decision on whether to go forward and assist that officer, leaving the rear quite vulnerable. We got up to the car, and we found that Ryder had actually got hold of one of our agents and was trying to suck us in.
How long was this going to go on for?
You remember back to the training you get, listen to the commands of the sergeants and those in charge.
It's the most hostile, aggressive crowd dynamic that I've ever come across.
For the first time in my career, I actually thought we'd lost control completely.
We were just sitting targets.
We were outnumbered.
We had to back off because we just couldn't compete with that level of violence and the sheer numbers of people on our own. The decision was made.
The safest way for us to do was to get back in the carriers.
Everyone shouting, drive, just let's get out of here.
I've never been involved in anything like that before.
You work for the police, you expect to come with violence, but I've never experienced it on that level before.
I protocol never seen anything like it again.
That was just a gibbering mess because you've still got the adrenaline, which is still kicking in, but that's slowly dying down, and the reality of what's happened overnight hits you.
I'd been awake for over 24 hours. I'd only had one proper meal, and the adrenaline kept me going. And I got home and just pretty much fell apart. But I'd been told that I needed to be back in work for 7 PM.
I think we did the best we could do. We were just your normal police officers. If you probably call windows smashed, then your photos and I'll tell them, and then to be put into the right situation. But I think we did the best we could.
Okay. This is kind of, I haven't watched that video for ages. It's somewhat moving, but yeah, that process afterwards I thought was quite important, because if we hadn't interviewed police officers and if we hadn't heard their story, I think it would have been a kind of one-sided research study. And it was important for police too, because lots of people were complaining that police had disappeared, that they'd lost control, they didn't have the courage to fight the rioters. And I think what we found that was very interesting was actually what they did was completely in line with their tactics, which is the first thing that you do is you protect life. And that, if that is at the expense of buildings and property, then that's justifiable. So often what looked like retreating and abandoning was actually preservation of life. But also the frustrations of the police officers themselves, who felt that more needed to be done. But anyhow, that was the second part of the study. And I'm going to finish now talking to you by referring to one final element of this research study. And it was just one part, but I'm making more of it now because it chimes with the discussion this afternoon, which has been about social media and it's been about Twitter, partly. And you may remember that earlier on I said to you that the rioters were using BlackBerry Messenger. Yeah, so they were not using Twitter and Facebook to organise and to incite. But after the riots, police and senior government officials said that these rioters had been using Twitter and Facebook, especially Twitter. They called them the Twitter riots. And in fact, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, stood up in Parliament and said, these rioters have been using Twitter to organise and to incite. And what we need to do is meet with the security services to discuss how we can intervene in this technology in the future to stop people using it in a moment of crisis. And the police even admitted in Parliament that their lawyers had considered at the height of the riots whether they could somehow turn off Twitter in the UK. That was how much they believed that this was the case. So what we wanted to do was analyse that statement, test it, because our suspicion, our hunch, was it was rubbish. Now, why would somebody tweet, let's meet at Enfield train station at 4 o'clock? Because that's a public statement. That's the equivalent of going to your local village hall and, putting a letter on the wall and signing it with your name. It's a stupid thing to do. So we asked Twitter, the company, if they could give us all of the riot-related tweets. They create a database of all of the tweets from the riots and give them to us on a memory stick. And they did that. And the first thing we did was test this theory. And very quickly, we got some different statisticians from the university on board. Very quickly, they said, look, this is rubbish. Twitter was not used to incite the riots. There were a few people who said, let's meet at Enfield train station at 4 o'clock. But everyone, there are very few examples where people were inciting trouble on this platform. They were followed by a flood of other people who were saying, don't be so stupid. So they were often kind of outnumbered in a very significant way by regular people like you and I and regular folks who say that's a stupid thing to do. So it wasn't really functioning. Even if people wanted to use it to start trouble, it wasn't really functioning that way. So we came to that conclusion really quickly. In about 2 weeks' time, we'd done the work. So then we thought, well, can we do something else with this database? Here we've got 2.6 million tweets. We've come to a conclusion. What else can we do with it? And what we did was look at rumours. And this is an interactive we created. And I'm just showing you a short video of it. But you'll see it looks like bacteria that are growing in a petri dish. But what it is, each of these are different rumours. So this is a rumour that you're looking at the moment from, I think it's about McDonald's being broken into. And there was a rumour that McDonald's had been broken into and rioters were making themselves food. Now, if that sounds unbelievable, it's because it was completely unbelievable. But we wanted to take these rumours, dissect them, and analyse them to see if we can come to any conclusions about the way, this answers your question at the back, the way misinformation is spread through the Twitter sphere and how it's corrected. That was our objective. So we took these different rumours and basically kind of looked at them in some detail. And let me show you the first rumour. The first rumour was that London Eye was on fire. And there were lots of rumours that different buildings were on fire at different stages. One of them was that Big Ben was on fire. There was another one that Buckingham Palace was on fire and the Queen had jumped out the window. It was all, of course, rubbish. But, sometimes lies travel faster than truth. And, a picture of London Eye being on fire, well, that's going to fly. People are really interested in that. They're going to pass it along the chain as quickly as they can. And it gets quite interesting. So this is a picture, and it's tweeted by this individual, who I suspect, though cannot prove, is the person who created this picture. It says, oh my God, this can't be happening at London Eye. They know it can't be happening at London Eye because they probably just photoshopped it. Okay? So they take some fire and they put it on the London Eye. And you can see here, this individual just has 18 followers. So just with 18 followers, cleverly they use a number of hashtags, so lots of people get to see this tweet. 18 followers, and you just drop a rumour into the Twitter sphere and see what happens. And obviously then it gets picked up and retweeted and retweeted. And what's interesting then is how different actors operate in this field. And here's one. Can anyone in London confirm the status of the London Eye. People debating whether these pics are fake. Now this is Andy Carvin, and he works for National Public Radio. And as you can see, he has 85,000 followers. It's hugely influential. Now, Andy Carvin, anyone know about Carvin? Has anybody heard of him? Yes, one or two people. So Andy is well known because he is known as the guy who kind of tweeted the revolution in Egypt and much of the Arab Spring. From Washington, he used Twitter to kind of report what was happening on the ground in the Middle East. And that's how he made his name. And here he is, still in Washington. And the kind of brand of journalism that he does is to, crowdsource these questions and to try to use the crowd to verify whether the London Eye is on fire. What do people think of this tweet? Does anyone think it's problematic? Does anyone have a problem with it, or do people think it's good, effective? Well, I mean, I have a bit of a problem with it. Have you heard the phrase kind of shouting fire in a crowded theatre? Yeah? So when someone's in a crowded auditorium like this, someone shouts fire, and then there's a rush and people get trampled on. I think this is a little bit like shouting, I think there might be smoke in a crowded theatre. This person isn't saying London Eye is on fire. Andy's not saying that. He's saying it might be. Can you help confirm? I have a bit of a problem with this because I think that this is a tacit endorsement that this picture might be true. Yeah? It might be accurate. And in doing so, to some degree, I think it's fueling the rumour. Now he could have looked and said, well look, this individual has just 18 followers. It's a picture of London Eye on fire. Is it responsible to kind of retweet it and endorse it to some degree? Now some other people might think this is fine. Other people might say, well, he's put a question mark there. He doesn't know whether it's accurate or not, and he's trying to get people to help him. But I depart from that slightly. Anyhow, after this, the rumour becomes enormous. Suddenly, loads and loads of people are retweeting. Not, can anyone in London confirm? The London Eye is on fire, they're saying. And then it becomes, people get quite nervous. But I'm more interested in how these rumours are popped, how they are sold. And that, we found, was often completely independently of journalists. So here's one person replying to Andy Carvin, and they say, the London Eye is not flammable. It must be a hoax. Paint burns much different. To burn iron needs much heat. So they're kind of pointing out a question of physics, really, chemistry, that basically the London Eye could not be on fire because it's made of metal. But there were many other people who were saying to Andy Carvin, well look, I live near the London Eye, I'm looking at it now, there are no flames. Other people were actually going to the scene to check and reporting back, no, it's not on fire. But these people, who were they? Now, they were not journalists, and they were sorting fact from fiction themselves. Here's another example. So this person says, hearing reports that London Zoo was broken into and a large amount of animals have escaped. Too far, that's not true. And this person, who's we suspect is the person who may have created this rumour, has 5,000 followers. Now, it's just dropping the rumour. After that, what that gets interesting as well, because then somebody else says, oh my God, reports of tigers roaming around Primrose Hill. And then they provide a link. And here is a link to what they say is a picture of a tiger on the street. And you can just guess, this was just one of several pictures. There were penguins walking along Parliament, there was a bear in Buckingham Palace, there was monkeys jumping over walls. London had been invaded by animals, pretty much. And people believed it. People believed it. There was so much panic going around that people believed these rumours were true. But again, those bacteria that we show at the beginning, if you look at that interactive, when those bacteria change colour and people are disproving these rumours, it's regular people. Someone says, London Zoo is safe. That's a 2008 picture of a tiger in Italy. Okay. Now, who was this person? Just someone with 6,000 followers. I've got no idea who this person was. But I'm really interested that this person was doing what they were doing. Because really what they were doing was journalistic. They took the picture, they put it into a website that lets you search photographs. They did a little bit of investigation and found out the picture was 2 years old. And that's, I guess, kind of where we conclude. Because I hope I've talked to you a bit about collaborative journalism and the direction of travel. We can have some questions now. But I'll leave you with a kind of concluding thought, which comes from that, that person who's saying, that picture is a hoax. And that's this. I think we've reached a point in history, because of the way technology has enabled us to share information, that for the first time, if you were to remove all of the paid journalists, all of the professional journalists from planet Earth, just kind of zap them off, news would still travel. And that news eventually would be accurate news. It wouldn't just be unverified rumour, because people have the tools to check. And that wouldn't have happened before. So if you think of, I don't know, the Boston bombings last week, that had happened 20 years ago, and we didn't have the tools that we have today. And all of the journalists were sucked off planet Earth. We might hear about the Boston bombings when the ship finally arrived from Boston, and someone, who was working on the ship said, did you hear about what happened in Boston? But we wouldn't know without journalists, without newspapers and broadcasters and television. But if that happened today, without journalists, we would. So that doesn't mean that we are redundant. I think journalists in this new ecosystem are probably more important than they ever were. But it does mean that we have to quite radically change the way we do our work and the way we think of what we are. Okay, any questions? Yes? Can I have the mic? You okay?
Okay, going back to the Boston bombings, there were a lot of people twittering what they heard on police scanners and what they saw on their backyard about the search occurred. And what do you think that affects the future Twitter feeds, as the police were asking not to tweet what they saw, what they heard, and people still tweeted talked about it. So they were afraid that the bomber might see where the police are, what they were doing, and thus escape them.
I think that's a really very, very interesting observation. So I think two things. The first is that police, neither police or anyone else can control this information. So there's no point in police asking people not to tweet the names of suspects in the Boston bombing, because they'll do it anyway. And if people find a way, governments or anybody else finds a way to clamp down on one technology, people will migrate to a new one. So the police, law enforcement, governments, companies, everybody has to do what we have to do as journalists, which is not kind of lust over a bygone era, but just adjust. This is the new information framework in which police have to do their job, unfortunately. There are advantages and disadvantages. One of the disadvantages is the people thereafter can monitor these networks the same that we do. The second thing I think about it, well, it shows how often people can be wrong. And I think this is the last point I made in the presentation was that it makes journalists more important. So what people are gradually starting to realise is that when they read online, on Twitter, someone naming a suspect because they heard it on a scan, it may not be true. In fact, it probably won't be true. So then what do they do? I think what they do then is gravitate towards journalists, because we do try to distinguish between what's true and what's not true. And we do have that trust. That is why I have a bit of a problem with what Andy Carter does, because I think that's our only currency. That's why we'll be so valuable in the future, is the answer to the future. We talk about future. Why we're going to become so valuable is because that sense of chaos will only increase as more and more people use this technology. And if we can be stable and reliable and trustworthy when others are not, then we have something that's really, really important and what people will value. Any other questions? There must be questions. Wow. I hate to say this, but it's much better.
Okay, so as we have seen on the Twitter wall, Finland has about 63,000 Twitter people who are using Twitter.
How many?
63,000.
Yep.
So that's not a lot, considering you have Great Britain, USA. How does that affect on getting information?
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought there would be more. Well, you know, there's...
We are shy using it.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, look, my sense, I can't remember the figures now, I think in the world there's about 200 million. And Facebook is like 1 billion or something, right? So, but Twitter's increasing by huge amounts each year. It's really big in some places like Indonesia and Brazil for some reason. But I don't think there's any doubt that it will become as commonplace as the kind of handsets that people use for it. It's just a question of time. So the first thing I think is that we're in a place now that will look and feel very different to where we will be in 3 years' time. For anyone who's a journalist, though, this is a golden period. If you haven't quite reached the threshold where everybody is using it, particularly your competitors. You know, back in 2009, I signed up to Twitter on March the 28th, 2009, and I started investigating one story, which was the death of a newspaper seller who died at some protests. And I was at a huge advantage because the number of people who were using the technology was so small that it was much more manageable. And investigating this death with other people's help was a triumph, actually, partly because also no other journalists were using it. So if you're reluctant to kind of embrace these things, I think there's always an advantage in being first, and actually there's an advantage in being at that point in history where everybody is yet to adopt the technology. But I might be wrong on this, but my hunch is people will start using it because they'll realise it's useful to them. You know, when there's another big story, this is what happened in Boston. Something happens in Boston, people turn on the television, and they're stunned that all they're hearing is people talking rubbish, filling air. They have a reporter on the ground stood by a satellite van, trying to fill the airwaves, and then back to the studio, and somebody else reading off a telescreen. And then they will turn to their computers, and they will realise there's a huge amount more information, some of which will be unreliable, but some of which will tell them a lot. And when people realise that, I think more of them will use it.
Do you think that the more people have Twitter followers, the more reliable they are?
No. Do you?
No, I don't know. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah. No, I don't think that. You know, people can be popular for different reasons. Of course, celebrities have lots of followers. You know, there are some comedians have lots of followers. Certain politicians have lots of followers, and none of those are reliable. But you know, for journalists, I think there's a new category of journalists which has been born from was born around 2010, 2011, and I kind of call them anchor journalists. So they do what Andy Carvin does, which is they pretty much exclusively work in this space, and they aggregate and curate from around the Twitter sphere. They become very effective at sorting and searching. And there are increasingly more and more algorithms that will promise to do this for you. And they're setting themselves up as people who will just make sense of this for you. And they have quite a few followers. So Andy Carvin is one. There's another guy at the Wall Street Journal called Apt Field Producer. There are people in the New York Times who do this a lot. And I think they're staking their reputation on reliability. Because the one thing I can tell you from having an influx of followers during the riots is this is a really sad thing to observe. Afterwards, people unfollow. And then you see your follower count disappear. This is an existential point I'm going to make, but I do sometimes think about when we are all older, in our 60s and 70s, and we've retired and we're no longer working, and we're kind of approaching the end of our lives, and we're becoming less significant. How sad it will be to see our follower count slowly dwindle. Yeah. I mean, it's inevitable. It will happen to all of us. You know, it will be a signifier that we're now going down. Yes. Any other questions, or are we going to finish on that point? Yes. Oh, yes.
Use your microphone. My question sort of involves a hypothetical. If there were riots in, say, London and Paris simultaneously, interconnected, I mean, Twitter is international, it's used internationally. So if there are riots where the event is international and the reasons behind it are international, pan-European, how would the Guardian cover that? Do you have a plan for, you know, who will you team up with? How will you do that sort of a reading the riots thing if it's not in the UK only?
Well, that's a good question. We don't have a plan. I mean, we never had a plan when this happened. We all want to be more internationalist. I mean, look, the advantage the Guardian has, or any news organisation in the UK or the US, is that we're English speaking. And so, potentially, our audience can expand, and that's why the Guardian as a news organisation, our direction of travel now, again, point towards the future, is we're investing in the States, because we think that's where we can most grow. Currently, we have around 70 million people a month read the Guardian website. A third of them are British, a third live in the US, and a third other countries. So we would want to be quite internationalist in approach to that. But you know, I think the very first thing, you've got two elements of the story. You've got the reporter on the ground, and you've got how people deal with it in the office. I think it's live blogging. You know, I think live blogging will become probably the primary tool for conveying news in the future, because it's so adaptable. It's constantly changing. It's collaborative, and it draws on all of the expertise from around the world. You know, you no longer just have to rely upon the knowledge and the skills of your own journalists. You've got everybody who can contribute to that. So the first thing would be that I would say live blog, and after that, who knows? Okay.